Privileged to be here. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, council members. I've spent the day here in City Hall. I have to say that Toronto certainly lives up to its reputation of having exceedingly nice people. So thank you for having me here. Really appreciate the work and the rigor that has gone into the process so far. This council and the report reflects a seriousness of purpose. I spent last night here in Toronto. I actually stayed at East York off of O'Connor. I stayed with my host, Caroline, who you'll be hearing from later on. She has a basement apartment that she makes available in her house when her adult children aren't there. I also felt very safe because she's a police officer here in Toronto. Today, Airbnb is a platform that has had 180 million guest arrivals. We're in 65,000 plus cities, 191 countries, and we've really been blessed with this type of growth because of the value proposition that we deliver. We are a platform for the middle class. We're democratizing tourism by really making it more accessible for the middle class. 1 in 3 people who travel on Airbnb will not have been able to travel or stay as long, but for the fact it's more affordable for them. In fact, today we're releasing an analysis just showing that here in Toronto, middle-class families are able to come and visit this great city because it's a more affordable option for them, and this is in the context of the hotel industry doing exceedingly well here, and there's a big enough pie for everyone to do well. Secondly, we're democratizing the revenue from travel and tourism. We want to keep the money here local. 50% of the money spent by an Airbnb traveler actually stays in the neighborhood where they're staying. That generated $417 million last year in Toronto, and travelers spending $100 million that went to the restaurant industry. And then third, we're democratizing capitalism, making sure that the middle class is really benefiting from this. 80% of our hosts are using the homes that they live in that would otherwise not be available. They make 97% of the money that they list their home for. A typical host here makes their home available 53 times a year and makes about $3,500. 52% of them actually depend on that money to make their mortgage and make their rents. This is really the difference between many people being able to stay in their homes or not. I think you'll hear that from our great hosts today. Over the course of the last year or so, we've put in place more than 350 partnerships, agreements with governments around the world, and I think we've learned some important lessons. I think the first lesson is that every city is unique and different, and that you need to work with those cities to address their issues, and we're happy to be part of the process here. I think the second thing that we've learned is that we do believe we need to be regulated. This is a new thing. In the same way you went from a horse and buggy to a car, you need new rules for the new thing, and it's our commitment to help provide the tools that we can to help put those new rules in place. And then third of all, and for us really important, is that we really should be optimizing for using this platform to help the middle class. This is a tool of economic empowerment at a time when there's economic stagnation. Particularly pleased that we've received the support of Unifor, which is the largest private sector union in Canada, a group that has always fought for the middle class and working families, and I think that reflects the fact that this is a platform that is designed to help the middle class. In conclusion, I'll just say that really impressed with the work that has been done here. We're at the table here to help work with the city and to support the city. We understand that's our responsibility. Over the last couple of weeks, we've done partnerships in Mumbai, India, in Japan, inclusive of Tokyo and Osaka, and most recently Mexico City, which I understand is actually a sister city of Toronto. I'm happy to answer any questions, but again, thank you for the time and thank you for the work that this committee has done.
Thank you, Mr. Lehane. Are there questions, first of all, from... By the way, I've been here 2.5 years. You have the distinction of being the first person that actually came forward and said, I think we need to be regulated. Nobody ever comes here and says that.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I'll tell you something. I stood before the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is an entity in the United States, about 250 big city mayors, and about a year ago I stood up before them and said, I'm going to say something that no private sector entity has ever said. Read my lips, we want to pay our fair share of taxes. So we do believe in regulation, and part of that also is paying the tax piece, so thank you for saying that.
Questions of Mr. Lehane. First, anybody from outside the Executive Committee? All right, members of the committee. Councillor Palacio.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. So, in principle, you do support the recommendations that everything is?
Yes, certainly based on what we've seen in the report. And as I said earlier, I really applaud people for the rigorous work that's gone into this.
Has Airbnb work in collaboration with policymakers within other jurisdictions to have regulatory frameworks that addresses local needs and concerns that have been expressed all throughout? And if so, do you have any samples?
I'm sorry, so the question was?
If you have any examples of other jurisdictions where you've been able to work in collaboration with.
Oh, sure. I think, mentioned a couple. Mumbai, India, we just worked on. Mexico City, we just got done. The country of Japan. We have more than 350 plus partnerships in the United States, places like Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, San Jose, state of Arizona, various places in Florida. It's been our commitment really dating back to the end of 2015. We put out something called the Airbnb Policy Compact, where we committed to working with cities based on a series of principles, paying our communities fair share of taxes. That means paying the hotel or tourist tax. We now have 250 actually agreements where we take on the responsibility of collecting that tax and then remit it on a monthly basis to cities. It's been very, very successful. Sharing data so cities can see what the platform looks like down to the neighborhood level. And of course, coming up with those individual policy solutions. I think one thing that it appears that the report has really taken into account is an understanding that while there may be 15 to 30,000 units of housing that are vacant here in Toronto, one of the real big issues here is that the cost of housing has gone up, I think, about 30% in the last year or so. Again, people here would know this better than I. While at the same time, wage stagnation has been a big challenge, about 1% increase in wage over the last year here in Toronto. And so I think what the report really reflects is an understanding that people using the homes that they live in, homes that would otherwise not be available, spaces that would otherwise not be available, can be used to generate that supplemental income. So very impressed with what the report reflects in that regard.
Thank you. Are there any other short-term rental platforms in Toronto, for example, that have not been taken into account in terms of what's happening with the short rental, and I'm referring to Flip Key or Home Away and whatever else. Is there anyone else? Are you working in collaboration with them, and where do you see yourselves in relation to the other disruptive technologies that are coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't speak on behalf of the other platforms and other companies out there, but certainly our commitment has been to work with cities to put in place these regulatory frameworks. Again, I think we need new laws for new things. Home sharing itself is not necessarily new, but over a digital platform is new, and so how do we sort of develop those new laws? But we do fundamentally need to be regulated, and that has been our commitment. What I would say, and again, I say this, with the utmost respect, as this committee and as this council considers the issues, I do think, it's important that as many processes are put in place to encourage as many other platforms to participate in the process. I think one of the things that we've seen, and a good example of this is in a couple of European cities, where we have engaged and we are actually helping those cities to be able to enforce the regulatory structures they put in place. Some others may not have. And what has resulted is that some folks have moved off to the other platforms. So ideally, this body puts in place a structure that really facilitates as many platforms as possible participating, but we certainly will from our perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Palacio. Other questions of Mr. Lehane? Councillor Barlow?
Thank you. So you said that about 80% of your users use their principal residency, correct? So do you know out of those 80% how many use the entire home or part of their home or a secondary suite?
No, I don't. And it's a great question. And I think one of the lessons that we've seen across the world is that is an incredibly difficult question to answer, because people will define things in any number of ways. And I think one of the big lessons that we have extrapolated, and again, I think this is reflected in the report that has come through at some level, is that using a system like the pass-through registration, where you have some type of a process where people identify that the housing they're using would not otherwise be available for the long-term market, serves as a very effective way to get at the goal of making sure that the platform is not being used to take long-term housing off the market.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So you could have, the pass-through registration, as I understand it, this is how it works in some other cities. So I'm assuming that the Toronto version will be similar to this, but obviously defer to this group. A potential home share will sign up, and when they go through the pass-through registration, they are potentially asked a series of questions. Sometimes you check the box, sometimes you give some type of an attestation. But as part of that process, you would be identifying and basically attesting to the fact that whatever part of your house, whether it's a basement, whether it's the whole house, whether it's a room, however you're structuring that, is housing that would otherwise not be available for the long-term market. And then some other parts of the world, have other provisions that they can build into that. We've seen some places that take a look at, some cities in the U.S. will have a provision where they have something where you're prohibited from being able to evict someone from their housing in order to either raise the rent or to use it for something else. And some of those places actually keep lists that we can use those lists to help effectively make sure that housing is not being taken off the long-term market.
So-
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So if I feel that this report actually needs a bit more work on that, you'd be willing to do that work with our staff?
Happy to work, and certainly based on our experiences. And, the one thing I would say on that is that, clearly agree that we want to work together to make sure we're not taking long-term housing off the market, but also keeping it simple enough so you don't create a bunch of ways that people begin to, and our experience is there's certainly ways to do that, and would like to work with, obviously, with this.
Fantastic. The other question is on the enforcement side. So you seem to be, you're one of many home sharing companies, and you seem to be very willing to cooperate. Do you feel like there's enough in the report that for other companies that are not as willing to cooperate with the city to make it so, or enough penalties that would discourage it not to do that?
I do, obviously, happy to have lengthier conversations about it. And this also comes back to that pass-through registration system. With a place like a Chicago and New Orleans, Denver, now San Francisco is in the process of doing, is using pass-through, so you're required to have to go through the pass-through connected to your license to be able to operate, in that particular jurisdiction. Now, that doesn't mean that someone could go off the books or to a different market, but it creates a much easier way for the city to be able to effectively be able to enforce, because if someone hasn't gone through that process, almost by definition, they presumably would be in violation, of the existing structure. And so it just makes it a lot easier on the enforcement side. And, obviously, I think, we're one of the larger platforms out there. And I think part of what we have talked about is that, we're willing to do this stuff and help try to bring along the whole market in that process. But the pass-through does give you an awful lot of those tools. And not to be repetitive here, but in the same way we talked earlier about how you need this new law for new things, the pass-through actually is the equivalent of going from the horse and buggy to the car, going from 5 miles an hour to a different type of speed limit, but still making sure that you're protecting people from a safety perspective.